which I think sticks up a prompt on your respective screen just to make notes. Okay, right. Well, good morning or good afternoon, everyone. Right, you will have seen the agenda for today, which is twofold. I thought we would kick off by talking about echo, which I'll come on to in a moment. Lends itself to all sorts of audio puns, but I won't do those. And then we move on to a discussion of the EDDI call last Wednesday, just for anyone's sort of comments or reflections from that. Those of you that were on and want to share anything on that before picking up on any other business. So firstly, what I will do on my screen, let me just get to the relevant bit. Probably put it on here. All right, so I will just share on, this is on echo on the screen, just to save you looking for it. So you should be able to see, I hope, a picture of the internet draft that was submitted, shall I scroll back down, in March for Echo, which is an expansion of the encrypted SNI sort of proposals that have been around previously to give some additional security. But basically to address one of the sort of few remaining chinks or perceived chinks in privacy once the DNS itself is encrypted. And what attracted attention to it of, I think, a couple of people was the suggestion that in at least the instance of some client software, if you want to use Echo, you may have to have DO specifically as opposed to DOT enabled on that client software first. So I think one example I saw was, for example, with Firefox. It may well require you to have DO on Firefox if you want to use Echo with Firefox rather than use it, switching on Echo on Firefox, but making use of the different resolver capability in your system other than through the browser itself. But basically, a couple of people sort of just flagged that to me last week and suggested that that would be a useful thing to just pick up on. I'm hoping that a few people have had an opportunity to have a glance through the material, either this internet draft or, and again, I'll just flip to them, the slide material, which again, I just quickly pop that on the screen. So this is, if I put it on, that's my cursor, just wait for it to come back. Oh, there it is. Right, so this was connected at the last virtual interim TLS working group session, which just gives an update to some of the sort of work around Echo, which is very much positioned as a work in progress, as you would have seen from the text if you looked at the internet draft, just to give a further update on how the activity has progressed. Unfortunately, I couldn't find a link to the recording of the of this particular session, so all I could share with you were the slides and a link to the Etherpad, and that's as much as I could locate. And you'll see there's still some open issues as per the slides. You'll have to use your imagination as to what the commentary was that went with it, unless of course you were yourself on that session. Oh, hang on, somebody's waiting to get in. My mistake. So downside of the new security features, you have to also pay attention to the virtual waiting room, which I will now switch off. So welcome to those of you. Apologies for keeping you waiting for a moment. I was doing screen share, and whilst I'm doing that, I can't see the status of the waiting room. Right, so in terms of Echo, I'll put it back, I think, onto the other screen for the which I'll share, which is just the internet draft as a reminder. So you can see the overview. So did that prompt any thoughts from anyone in terms of any views, well, firstly on the potential interaction with DO, or apparent lack of interaction with DOT? I don't think it was mentioned from my quick read through, and indeed any other thoughts in terms of whether it caused any unforeseen issues with the wider ecosystem. Those are really the questions I was keen to explore. So anyone want to kick off on that? Feel free just to jump in if you have any thoughts on it. Can't tell if that was someone coming in with thoughts or just breathing out loud. If you're commenting, you may wish to come off mute first.
So I think you've described what this is. Yeah, essentially it's hiding the server name indication, and I think the reason for doing that is in order to prevent monitoring. So there's I think a distinction here between just general on-path monitoring and monitoring by DNS resolvers. And my impression is this is going to drive. It's going to become like HTTPS was. You know, it's going to be used by the majority of the traffic, and therefore it will be able to achieve one of its aims, which is the sensitive traffic doesn't stick out because it's just part of that majority that is routinely using encrypted SNI. So if you fast forward a couple of years, then there's the only thing you can do by monitoring port 443 on the internet is you can see that there are packet flows going to different sources of content, different CDNs, but you lose that visibility of which websites they are unless you're doing heuristic analysis or you happen to be one of the DNS resolvers being used by people, in which case obviously the DNS resolvers, even in the use of DO, they are able to understand the content that you're trying to reach. So this, I suppose, it just gives us even more incentive to ensure that encrypted DNS is deployed in the right way, because yeah, it's the only remaining mechanism to do anything at a network level in terms of destinations like selecting cache content that's close to you, that kind of thing.
Yeah, I was going to say, Chris, it was, in terms of whether it breaks or risks breaking anything, CDN sprung to mind potentially as one sort of possible issue there. because clearly it's hard to tell what content, well, it's even harder to tell what content is being sought, of course. So if you spoke, then we might.
Same as everything in this area, you lose sight of it. So all the network optimization turns into friendly clients, everything else.
Yeah.
If you can't see it, you'll just go fight with the rest. So anybody trying to be nice to Netflix, YouTube, your own content, whatever, it'll just be, if I can't see what it is you're sending, I'm not going to be able to tag your traffic for video, for special, any optimization of locality or anything like that. It'll just be, you're in the mix.
Yeah.
Have fun. That might work for you, and it might not.
So I guess that may have a few issues for CDN providers then. in that case, Alistair.
Oh yeah, CDN providers, networks with lots of CDN caches on their network. You can't meaningfully do anything useful there. You can just say, up to you, CDNs. We'll give you any information we can give you, but that's it. You've got to make a decision.
Yeah.
And if that happens to not coincide with being useful for the network, sorry, can't help you.
Yeah. Do you foresee any other impacts, Alistair, just out of interest?
Well, there's all the security types are going to be absolutely. One lot are going to be particularly happy because, let's face it, the the red teams and the black hats are going to be just jumping for joy. I can do anything and you can't tell.
Yeah.
And the other side are going to be going, so how do we protect our data? Short of pulling the internet out and not allowing outbound connections to anything.
Yeah.
Except via a proxy in which you have to communicate.
Oh yeah, it'll break it, and then that will break because there'll be full-on checking of the cert. It'll just be, yay, you can't go to this, you can't use this service because they've set it up so it checks. Sorry. The answer will be sorry. You're not going there. But that's
the deeper trouble's more for those IoT devices and the things where you can't enforce a proxy.
Oh, you can't do anything with them. They're going to be an absolute nightmare. They're going in their own network. So ISPs, we're going to have to start building, essentially giving customers two networks and saying, if you want to be secure, you've got to put your IoT on the second network. Otherwise, it's going to be the Wild West.
So by that, Alistair, you mean what? So on your router, you'd have
to somehow segregate it so that traffic cannot. You can be very draconian about the IoT side and the not IoT side.
Yeah.
From the IoT's point of view, you are not on the same network. You're always out of home.
Yeah. Sorry, Paul, you were saying?
So it's just the equivalent. Network slicing, would be the rough
okay. Yeah.
equivalent in the mobile network. Is we're going to have to slice these folks into many different services that are offered to customers in the future.
Yeah. So a bit like at the moment, you got 2.4 and 5 on Wi-Fi. You'd effectively have two separate SSIDs on your router potentially. IoT, not IoT, or whatever.
That is one way of doing it. I mean, other than that, I don't see what you can do because loads of people use CDN, so an IP address will only get you so far, and this smells like it's even more likely to end up being well, hey, we got some front end services that send you to the back end. That's useful. I don't know who you are. I can no longer. I'm not even sure I'm going to be able to use your IP address as a good guide to the possibility you might be going to a service I care about.
Now, the video optimization is going to break some of the unlimited services here in the U.S. on the mobility networks. There are several of them that I know are using content optimizers to basically de-optimize your Netflix video to a lower quality and still offer you unlimited services.
Right.
Yeah.
So, what you mean for zero rating then, Paul, that could then pose some issues.
Well, even just for, they've effectively built their model around the fact that they offer an unlimited service, but that unlimited service has rate limiting for things like video. So instead of letting you see the 1080p video when you're on your phone, they knock it down to 720 or 480, something along those lines. And they do that by looking at the SNI and directing you to a different Netflix stream based on some of that information.
So unless you get the corporation of Netflix as well, somehow that's not going to work in the future.
Yeah, certainly. Yeah, and they've been trying to do that, with other, Hulu and other services as well.
Yeah. Yes, using Netflix as the example, not any more than that. Okay. Any other ISP sort of representatives have any sort of immediate thoughts on that, or equally CDN providers? I see Ralph is on, for example. I don't know if you may have a view. I think. Or Jim.
So I haven't read it, so I can't kind of comment on it because I've seen other stuff. So, but from what I've heard, it's probably, I mean, the end goal was to have the encryption kind of end to end, and if you have encryption end to end, then well, nobody can see into it. I mean, I get that.
Yeah.
It's Greg here from 3. I probably should read it in that case, because it sounds like the implication for service providers such as mobile networks is going to be that we are going to have to fracture the network into several chunks depending on who the client type is.
Depending on what you want to achieve, obviously.
Yeah.
It's and if you don't care, that's not a problem. But if you start having to care because you do something to optimize people's flows, so that we all know that 1% burn 99% of the traffic. There's not a lot you can do if you can't see what they're up to, unless you want to be brutal. And if you're going to be brutal, you have to you have to sort of slow everything down for them. You can't be nice.
It's not just a traffic management problem, is it, Alistair?
It's not just traffic management, it's a security management. You can't see anything in the security domain. There's flow optimization for things like voice, where some people, you've got it set up so that VoIP gets some guarantees. If you can't see into the content at all, you can't see where it's going, you can't say, that's a voice call, I'll sure be nice to you and give you some, at least a guarantee you'll get a decent call.
Yeah, there's also free rating. So yeah, you can't, if this is adopted widely and it's kind of like default for anything hosted on CDN, then how then do we identify NHS content and say, okay, that's free, that doesn't come out of your allowance, whereas the other stuff does?
Yeah.
I've got a load of people who are saying that the internet for those kind of things, the internet turns into friendly applications that will let you see what's going on, and the rest. In all senses. So that's for traffic management, security management, everything. It'll just be, these ones won't let us see what's going on at all, not even slightly. And those you can't do anything about, so you treat them accordingly. And those people that will tell you things, and those people you can do useful things to as required. It's not the end of the world necessarily, but it does limit the choice. It does limit the availability of certain data. It also brings the current world, although there's lots of sharing of IPs, granted, there's still quite a high percentage of services that live on an IP address, and you can actually go IP equals service. But if you don't have the DNS, you won't have that mapping. you won't be able to build that mapping because you won't have a cache to build it from.
So I guess on the positive side, just thinking about net neutrality.
It's exceedingly hard to break net neutrality.
Yeah. On the negative side, things like sort of quas and so on.
Yep.
Are,
And all of those country-specific socially conscious filtering will break. All variants of, because we're going to assume that sort of your DNS goes dark, unless it happens to go to your DNS, you can't do anything there. And this stops all of those in-network flow things, unless they're willing to be overzealous and just block an IP address.
Yeah.
Whereas now a lot of them will snoop the SNI and go, oh, okay, that's a name I trust. That's not one of the names I'm expecting to block. I'll just let that through.
Yeah. Okay. Any other reflections from anyone?
A bit of something.
Yeah, go on, Jim.
There was an interesting talk at the Open Source Working Group at the White meeting last week. A very short thing from EDDI, who's the guy that's responsible for N2P. He now claims that the N2P toolkit is able to do deep packet inspection, or there's some variant of that toolkit that is able to do that. And he promises, or claimed, if I understood him correctly, he can handle TLS 1.3 in this toolkit.
Oh.
So I'm just reading from one of the slides. NDPI includes support for string-based protocol detection, DNS query name, HTTP host server fields, TLS quick SNI server name indication. And alleges it can do things like detect Netflix queries going over HTTP, Skype, Facebook stuff, all the rest of it. Maybe worth having a look at it. And maybe at some point in the future, maybe we can ask Luca to come along and tell us more about it.
Yeah.
This isn't the same guy who solved the IPv4 exhausting problem, is it?
No, not this time, fortunately. Or maybe he has an alter ego, Brett, but I don't think so.
Okay.
Okay, that's interesting. So, well, using that as an example then, Jim, so basically the implication is that tools like that could suddenly become very interesting to people.
Exactly. I mean, I doubt very much they're actually going to be able to break, a TLS connection, but I wouldn't be surprised if NDPI might be in a position to fingerprint the traffic path and to say, that TLS session appears to be doing DNS, or that TLS session appears to be for some kind of encrypted web streaming thing, such as Netflix or whatever.
Yeah.
You won't be able to see, I would be stunned if you could actually see the actual content, but you might be able to figure this out beforehand. And remember, of course, there was that researcher presentation at the ITF meeting last summer, ANRW it was, where they could say that just based on the timings of the packets that are going across the encrypted session, they could fingerprint what was going on, even if they couldn't actually tell exactly what was in the actual encrypted payloads.
Yeah, but I believe one of Nominet's researchers has also been looking into being able to fingerprint DOH traffic, actually. And I think he's had some success as well.
That's good to know.
I'm happy to have a word with him and see if he wants to come on the call and talk about it sometime. If
that would be great, Brett.
That's always useful to know that you might be able to spot things that may be doing what you're not expecting.
Yeah. Okay, I'll have a word with him and see if he wants to come on and talk about it.
Okay, thank you.
Well, I've put in the chat window the URL for the presentations that was given there. And the open source working group only had a 10-minute slot in the virtual meeting, so you can actually pick up the recording of exactly what was said and what was asked afterwards.
Right.
Yeah, I think Zoom chat doesn't let you cut and paste because security, presumably. So you might want to put it on an email.
Link worked fine for me.
Oh, okay. That does not working for me. A different version of Zoom, maybe.
Yeah, I tried it as well. Just as you were saying that, Ian, and yeah, it gave us curious Zoom URL. I don't know why. It always used to cut and paste, so then maybe that's an enhancement in the latest version, perhaps.
Yeah, maybe it's you have to pay, you know, the fancy premium prices to get that feature.
Yes, cut and paste. No.
Me pay premium prices, Jim? Never.
You know me, I'm a cheapskate, Greg.
Okay, all right, I think that's helpful. Anyone else want to chime in with any other observations before we move on to the EDDI call last Wednesday?
Well, I was just thinking that maybe there's a role here for the IETF to define a way for a content provider to mark its own traffic such that it can be identified as being from that content provider.
Yeah.
So, for example, I mean, I used the example of the NHS before. So let's say that the NHS, but it could be any content provider that wants to be identified. You know, let's say they set a particular bit in the IP header or something like that, that then links, or that then packets that are flowing through the mobile network, because that's where I work, they can be identified as being, okay, that's clearly NHS. And it may not be, we don't know what the SNI was because that's encrypted. We don't know. We do know the IP address, but services like this, they tend to be made up of many, many different flows going from different destinations. So if there's a means for that to be tagged in a way that can be shared with, you know, with the consent of the parties involved, then, you know, that could solve at least the zero rating problem without compromising too much on privacy policies.
Yeah.
Certainly possible to do that. Something like network services header would be one standard that would cover that. But I know even without a standard, some of the US service providers got marked for doing the opposite of that. They put a subscriber ID in the HTTPS transactions and were selling the data publicly a couple of years ago. But, you know, if you do it in one direction, you should be able to use the same tech to do it in the other.
Yeah. And I guess make sure there's some protection so it can't easily be abused by some enterprising other content provider labeling all of their content as NHS, so it's zero rated. So you get excellent free 4K video.
That's a good point. Doing it with some kind of signature on it with a PKI or something along those lines.
Yeah.
Yes, because we already have fraud. And yes, we don't want more fraud.
Yeah. Well, can I suggest those of you for which this is of interest, if you haven't read the documents, do take the time to do so. And perhaps even more importantly, it seems to be going through at a reasonable pace within the working group. So now would be an excellent time to engage with the working group and contribute your thoughts and ideas whilst this is evolving, rather than finding out too late in the day that it's already settled. Okay, let's on that point then move on to the EDDI virtual session last, I think it was last Wednesday, sort of around about this time of day actually, coincidentally, which Glenn set up to go through 3 separate use cases. For anyone that wasn't on the call, Glenn creatively used Microsoft Teams to have a plenary session and then move to 3 breakout sessions before reconvening on a plenary session. I know Andy's had to drop off, but between Chris, Andy and we took a few notes from each of the 3 breakout sessions to feedback to Glenn to subsequently put onto GitHub as appropriate. Just to for me to stop talking for a moment, Chris, is there anything you want to call out from your session, or the session with which you were involved, I should say, with others of note? You're on mute if you are talking.
Not at the moment. Only because it happened before the weekend, and a lot has happened since then.
Comment.
I can call up my notes.
So let me just myself also locate your notes. If I can find them. Oh yeah, here we are. So yeah, just to label it, give Chris a chance to collect his thoughts. His particular breakout session focused on split DNS and some of the challenges entailed with that. As I say, Chris, I mean, don't comment just for the sake of it, but was there anything especially noteworthy that jumped out at you from the discussion that springs to mind, assuming it's coming flooding back to your memory?
No, I mean, it's essentially the cases identified were ones that are well recognized. It is a problem in many environments, and it's a challenge for encrypted DNS to handle it if you are changing the default resolver.
Yeah. And I don't know who else was involved in your breakout session, but if anyone else that's on the call happens to be on now that wants to comment, again, feel free to chime in if you wish. Because if not, as I say, I think Glenn will put the relevant components onto GitHub for your perusal shortly. Of the other two sessions, Andy Fiddler covered the consumer home, and if I do say so, it's a shame he's not on the call. I think has provided some exemplary notes, which span 4 or 5 pages in total, which is pretty impressive. From about, well, not especially long amount of time, was it half an hour or so, 40 minutes? Really just covering some of the issues, some of which I think will be familiar to people, such as the fact there might be sort of different classes of users, if I can call them that, say parents and children, for example, that may wish to have different types of access to different types of content, etc. But as I say, it has put very comprehensive notes from the session, which will be added to the GitHub. Again, I don't know who else was on that session. If you were on there and want to make any comments, feel free to do so. Otherwise, I'll continue talking to say, and then the sort of third session was on sort of public Wi-Fi, be that coffee shops or hotels, and linked to that clearly the sort of perennial captive portal. And the thing from that which potentially jumped out at me, apart from the obvious stuff that you'll be familiar with, is if your default resolver is, say, DO, could be anything, but let's say it's DO, but then fails over to the system resolver, if it's unable to connect, it's possible you may eventually get onto the sort of landing page to authenticate and then use a service. But as I think some people on here before have commented, some settings, the client software would retry the selected resolver on each occasion that it tries to use DNS. So potentially you could have a very poor user experience, even if it does work. If it each time tries to use your selected DNS before failing over to the system resolver. So that was certainly one of the observations that came out of the discussion, and that's assuming it works at all, because clearly if it fails closed, it may not function at all. Again, Glenn's got the notes to transcribe onto GitHub, so that will start to populate GitHub. And I think the plan is to repeat the exercise potentially with different use cases, but also doing it in different time zones. So I think from what Glenn said, they'll probably look to do something which is more amenable for those of you in North America next. So a bit later in the day. Albeit we did have some people from North America on the session last week, and no doubt there'll be some Europeans potentially, and maybe even from Asia joining the next call, depending on what time of day Glenn goes for. So it only took, I think it was a couple of hours end to end, so it was pretty straightforward and definitely worth doing. I think we'll start to put some flesh on the bones of use cases. Something which again I know has been encouraging us all to spend some time on. So I think it felt like a pretty time efficient way of doing it. Anyone got any questions on that before we move on? If not, keep an eye out. No doubt Glenn will send out an email when the content is on GitHub for your review. Right, which brings us on to any other business. I've got one thing which I'll mention in a moment, but does anyone have anything else that they would like to bring up? And I've sort of noted both Jim and Brett's comments in that respect with that link that Jim's already shared. So I'm making note of that for a future call, see if we can get the author to come on to present that. But anything that anyone else wants to bring up on this call? If not, the one thing I will mention, just as a reminder, that you all would have seen Tommy Jensen's post to the EDDI list last week, if not the blog post directly anyway, that DOE support in Windows 10 is now available through the Windows Insider program. So if you've got access to that, you can try DOE. I did read something this morning which suggested that at the moment the options are currently limited to 3 resolvers, Cloud9 and 2 others, which I can't remember off the top of my head. But I think that's just temporary, that it's limited to those 3. So if you've not seen that, I'd urge you to have a look. If you
can configure your own, can't you? The only catch is when you configure your own, you have to ensure that you also configure the system's DNS resolver IP address to be the one that points to yours. I think that was my understanding of it. I haven't actually tried it.
Okay. I don't know if anybody on the call has had a chance to yet. It was only last Wednesday, Thursday that was confirmed. If not, maybe somebody can report back in the next few days, Chris, whether they have done that and it does indeed work in the way that you think.
There would be a question on this.
Yeah, sure, Norman.
Question on this would be: do you have any typical time horizon from where the published in this stream basically of development kind of hits the general public Windows. Is this like a 3-month or a 6-month thing that is the historic delta? Obviously, there is a scheduled mechanism in Chrome, which is published.
Yeah.
Similar scheduled things have been there in the past for Windows with like half-year releases, right? Every half years there's like run release, and then they basically say there is a March release and a September release or something like this. So the question is this next year's March release, or is this year's September release? What we're going to see, and that may of course have some impact on how urgent is it to be supporting this on scale.
Does anyone have any insight on that on the call? Because if not, I was talking to Tommy last week. I didn't think to ask him. That's a very good question, Norman. Anyone have a view on likely time frame? Because if not, I can easily ask Tommy.
I don't have a view, Andrew, but I think Norman's question is well made, so maybe we should ask Tommy to come back and talk about it if he possibly can. I think another aspect of the Microsoft announcement is what is the intention for this DO thing that they've done? Is this going to be part of some all singing, all dancing resolver subsystem that they're going to put into Windows that can cope with Active Directory and vanilla DNS and all sorts of flavors of encrypted DNS, or what's this all about? I mean, for most people, DO seems to be a thing that's in a web browser talking to some backend provider from Cloudflare or whoever. So I wonder if there's any other insight into what Microsoft might be planning to do there, or is this just something for experimental purposes to see what the general public might think of it?
Yeah.
You know, I believe when we had Tommy on the call, he was very clear that as far as he knew, there was no impetus within Nominate to do anything at DOH within Active Directory or on the server side at all. So I don't think they've got a joined up approach, is the impression I got.
I got the impression it was a separate team and he just didn't have a lot of relations to them at all.
Yeah, I think that he also mentioned in San Francisco that there are 2 teams. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, in which case, let me, I'll go back to Tommy and maybe see if we can get him on a call then to just give an update, give some clarity on time frame, and then we can have a discussion around how it may fit with their wider plans. Jim, yeah, that's a point well made.
But they haven't done the same approach on enlisting people into that list, right? I mean, that obviously the Edge guys seem to be mirroring what Chromium project does, whereas the operating system guys, it's really unclear how the selection there happens. And Nikolai, if I understand past discussions correctly, also on this call, Tommy has explicitly said that dealing with a long list of stuff is absolutely not in the interest of the operating system team. Wasn't that kind of one of the comments that
Yeah, that was my understanding, that a long list manually configured and handled is probably not the goal.
Mm-hmm.
So because it's not realistic. I mean, I talked to him about our scenario where we have not only one service address, but dozens of service addresses, and that was already, I wouldn't call it a showstopper, but he said, well, that's a scenario that they are not looking into. They are more waiting than for a discovery mechanism.
Yeah, and certainly having a similar conversation with Tommy on that being absolutely his preferred approach, to see a discovery mechanism coming out of IETF, and not being keen on going down a similar path as Chrome with a sort of manual process to add people onto a list, etc. So very much discovery being his preferred route for this, just so he doesn't end up with some legacy manual features that have to be maintained for a long time, especially given, as a couple of people alluded to, the sort of update cycle for operating system is somewhat longer typically than it is for browser software or other client software. Okay, all right, well, let me reach out to Tommy and see if we can get him onto a call to spend a bit more time on this. Sounds like that would be useful.
Did in the meantime any conversation happen with the browser guys at Microsoft, or have they been even identified to be interested in sharing their thoughts down here? Because that's kind of the other end of the spectrum of relevant people there. Or are we all here on the call assuming they're mirroring Chrome anywhere, so it's not worth having a special talk?
I'm certainly happy to ask Tommy for a steer on that, or at least to point me in the direction of the Edge team to find out. I suspect many of us probably are assuming it's going to be the same as for Chrome, but there's no harm in asking, Norman. Yeah. Okay, I'll tell you those two separate questions to see. Okay, any other business from anyone else? Take that as not. In which case, let's call it a day there then. Thanks all for your time. I hope that was useful. Those of you in the UK or Europe, enjoy what's left of a particularly pleasant afternoon. And those of you in North America, have a lovely, pretty much all of the rest of the day. Okay, thanks all.
Everybody.
Thanks, Andrew. Bye.
Bye. Bye.
Cheers.
Bye.